Live.
California Institute for Human
Close
Science.
this, and then I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and then we'll get the timer queued up, and in a minute we will start this, and then we'll begin in 10 minutes.
So at this point in time, people they get notifications. Notifications go out to, I think, about 20,000 of our subscribers who asked to be notified. And then, so people will be logging in, and even before the program begins, they will see these little thumbnails and will be able to hear everything we say.
Okay, good to know. Yeah. And I really do love your logo. Your
It came to me one day. I was walking down the street in San Francisco, and this image just popped into my head. Over 50 years ago, I had it, the design made on my wedding cake. When Janelle and I got married, I had the pastry chef put this in the frosting.
Oh, for heaven's sake. And so you've had it in your life all this time, but then really decided to use it for the New Thinking Aloud series.
Yes, that's when even before the New Thinking Aloud series, I developed an animated version. And then later, one of our listeners or one of our viewers from Australia, Anderson Chadwick, is that right, Emmy?
I think so. we always wonder because of their last name, but
a person has two last names.
It's Anderson. Yeah. It is Anderson Chadwick. Yeah. So it's the inverse of what you would think it would be.
Well, these days, a last name can be a first name, like Taylor Swift.
Right. Right. Or Anderson Cooper.
Yeah. So anyway, he took my idea, but he programmed it in a much more sophisticated way than I originally had. So this is what we use. And I like to give him credit for it.
Yeah, absolutely. It is beautiful and unique, colorful. It's, at IANS, we're planning our spring symposium, which will be April 26th, I think, and on the subject of near-death and related experiences, religion, spirituality, and healthcare. And we're in the process of choosing a logo, and the committee is split between people who want to go with something that's more colorful but kind of more explicit, and something it's less colorful but more like symbolic and interpretive. And so it's always a challenge to find just the right logo for something. This one is just perfect.
Yeah. I know back in the day when I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area, the Institute of Noetic Sciences worked with a company. He charges Fortune 500 companies huge amounts of money to design their logos.
Wow. Yeah. I suppose for people who are artistically talented, that can be a lucrative way to go.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot behind it.
For sure. Well, we're really fortunate at IANS. We have a graphic designer on our volunteer team, and she's also a board member, Marianne Sperry. And she just does the most amazing work. I'm just in awe of her creativity and inspiration and all that. Another thing that we've done recently at IANS is created fact sheets. I have to say that, fact sheets on topics like near-death experiences, after-death communication, terminal lucidity, and so forth. And she's designed these, the format to, each one has a different color, and but they all have the same format. So there's a unity and a uniqueness through them. And it's that whole I am not artistic, so this is just kind of amazing to me.
Well, I think if I'm correct, the IONS newsletter came into my email just yesterday. I took a long look at it and I was amazed. It kept going on and on and on. Your organization is very, very active. I think we have probably the best newsletter out there, but the next best one, I would say, and about equal in length, is IONS.
Wow, that's quite a compliment. And thank you. I'll pass that along to the people who produce it.
I was very impressed with all the activities going on, and I have to say as well, of course, that the people at Ions are just so loving.
Oh, thank you. I'm
You
so
walk
glad to hear
into the
that.
room, and the vibration of love just it just permeates
Yeah.
everything.
Well, that's really wonderful feedback, and I've experienced that too. The going to the in-person conference, which is where you were a couple years ago at the IANS conference, there is something energetic about that experience. And like you said, you just walking into a room or being in one of my former students went to the conference last year, and she said the moment she grasped the handle of the hotel, something went through her and it just stayed with her the whole weekend.
Mhm.
And yeah, there's something really energy. Well, being around a lot of people who've had near-death experiences,
Yeah.
there's a very particular energy there.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Contact buzz.
yeah, it is lots of fun.
Mhm.
So
And the conference this year is going to be in
in Oak Brook,
Lexington.
Illinois, which is a
Oh,
Chicago suburb.
oh yes.
It'll be the last weekend in August. We always
Mhm.
do it over Labor Day weekend, so everybody else has Monday off after the conference is Thursday
Mhm.
through Sunday.
I see.
And yeah, and although the IANS board meets on Monday, so we don't get a day off, but that's okay. And our theme this year, the book that is credited with opening the field of near-death studies is Raymond Moody's book, Life After Life. And you've
Mhm.
probably interviewed Raymond, haven't you,
Oh,
Jeffrey?
several times, sure.
Yeah. And so 2025 is the 50th anniversary. And so that's our theme for the conference this year is the past, present, and future of the field of near-death studies. And I think I mean, we have really great stuff planned already.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, so that will be at the end of August in the Chicago area. Yeah.
My wife has been kind of pushing us to go to that event because my family is from Milwaukee, and I could, just
Yeah.
Chicago and Milwaukee are so close to each other. It'd be easy to visit some family members.
That's right. Well, the call for proposals deadline is February 17th, so like a week from now.
Mhm.
So if you want to put in a proposal to do a presentation and make it worth your while, we would love for you to do that.
So did you say February 17th?
That's right. A week from Monday, a week from tomorrow is the
Oh,
deadline
okay.
for
Okay.
proposal submission. Yeah.
I,
Yeah. Do you have does anything just pop to mind that you would want to present about that's come up for you since the last time you were at IANS?
well, maybe Emmy and I are planning to do a live stream soon on a concept of how can you prepare to communicate with a loved one before you die. And so we're exploring the question of practicing the art of mutual dreaming
Oh,
based on the Jungian notion that the afterlife realm intersects the realm of dreams.
We have to practice dreaming, Jeff.
Yeah, that's my problem. I hardly ever dream anymore.
oh, huh.
And I
Wow.
don't know, I'm told that not dreaming is bad for your health, but I don't seem to feel any adverse effect of it. I don't feel like I'm missing a thing. I go into a meditative state more when I'm asleep rather than a dream state.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so have you all been actually practicing this?
No.
Not yet. Jeff just did a monologue on it, though. He did
Yeah.
an in-presence monologue discussing it. We're going to do a live stream in a couple.
Years ago, I interviewed the woman, Linda Lane Magalon, who wrote the book Mutual Dreaming. And so I'm basing the idea on her report. She has practiced it. She has worked with groups. She's very active in the Association for Dream Research.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. What a fascinating idea.
But we don't have any we don't have any data at the moment, but it is something that seems plausible given the
Well,
research about it.
yes. And one thing that you could do is make the presentation at the IANS conference to invite people to participate in your exploration.
Well, let's begin our program.
Okay.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove, host of New Thinking Aloud. I'm with Emmy Vadnais, my co-host, who
Oh,
does a wonderful job for New Thinking Aloud. And our special guest today is Janice Miner Holden, who is the president of the International Association for Near-Death Studies. She is a professor at Professor Emeritus, is that right? At
Mm-hmm.
University of North Texas. I hope I have that correct.
Right.
And a specialist in transpersonal counseling. And it occurred to me today, actually, since it's Super Bowl day, that there's a sense in which near-death studies is like the Super Bowl of the paranormal. And I say that because the evidence is so rich, because millions of people have had this experience, and because it forms a perfect intersection between parapsychology and transpersonal psychology. So
Yeah.
welcome, Jan. We're
welcome.
delighted to be with you and to share your knowledge and wisdom with the New Thinking Aloud audience.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey and Emmy. And I told Jeffrey just a few minutes ago, this is like a professional dream come true for me because I have been an admirer of Jeffrey's work ever since the original Thinking Aloud and use many of the recordings in my the course I teach at the University of North. I still teach, even though I'm retired, a course on the transpersonal perspective in counseling. So, so I'm just so honored to be here.
Oh, we're so happy to have you here. And before we get into all sorts of wonderful questions from the viewers, so if you have any questions, please post them in the chat. Also, let us know where you're joining from. I just want to let people know that we have 3 previous interviews with Janice Miner Holden. The first one is on evidential near-death experience. Then we did spontaneous after-death communication, and then the third is on induced after-death communication. So if you go to New Thinking Aloud, you can find that there. And welcome, Jan. It's a joy to be back with you again today.
Yeah, for me as well. Yeah.
Would you like to make a short opening statement to sort of set the tone for what we'll be talking about today, largely communication with our beloved departed friends and lovers and family members? And then we'll
Yeah.
take questions from our viewers.
Okay, that sounds great. Well, I'll just say a little bit that I I began my professional academic career studying near-death experiences. And within those experiences, people often meet deceased loved ones. So I became interested in after-death communication. That is after-death communication, but of course it happens a lot outside the context of near-death experiences. Most after-death communication occurs outside that context. just in people's everyday lives. Whether they're awake, asleep, meditating, it can happen in any state of consciousness. So I was also studying that phenomenon when I learned back, and I'm trying to remember, it might have been almost 20 years ago at a conference of the International Association for Near-Death Studies. Dr. Al Botkin talked about his discovery of induced after-death communication, which is a counseling psychotherapy technique to help grieving people by facilitating some other things, but also facilitating an experience of communication with the person that they're grieving, whose death they're grieving. And so I, a few years later, went up and got trained in it with Al, and brought some of my students with me. And when we came back here, we actually met in this office and practiced on each other before we let ourselves loose on our clients in our private practices, and had many fascinating experiences here. And then the thing that the big question for IADC is, how effective is it? And is it really better than just traditional grief counseling? So right before I retired in 2019, I conducted a study that actually ended up taking about 2 years to do, to compare the effect of IADC on people who are grieving compared to if they're doing traditional grief counseling. And and in the study, we got not only statistically significant results, but practically significant. So just in case your viewers don't know the difference between those, the example I like to use is, imagine that you're doing a study to help people stop smoking. And at the beginning, on average, people smoke 15 cigarettes a day. And then you do a treatment, and then you assess again and find that now they're smoking on average only 10 cigarettes a day. Well, that's a significant difference statistically to go from 15 to 10. But clinically, does it really matter if you're smoking 15 or 10? Are you really that much less likely to get cancer? So it would not be that clinically significant. But what we found in the IADC versus traditional grief counseling study is that people in the IADC treatment had significantly fewer painful grief symptoms at the end of the study. And it was not only statistically significant and very significant, but we got a very large effect size, meaning it's powerfully clinically effective. And it's kind of miraculous because the treatment consists of two 90-minute sessions 1 week apart. And so it was quite and it's very unusual in clinical research to get even a large effect size, more or less a very large effect size. So it really makes a difference, and it corroborates what Al has trained quite a few therapists, and they report that this technique has a positive effect that nothing else has. There's something like qualitatively different about this particular intervention. So it's been a really interesting process because up until this time, it's not that there aren't other people out there doing this kind of work, even in psychotherapy, but to my knowledge, none of those strategies has been put to the experimental test. So other strategies might be equally effective, but we don't know that. We know that this one is effective. So it's been really gratifying. And, that people who went through the study, who did the IADC treatment, were many of them were like profoundly affected, very a lot of tears of joy and things like that. But my favorite was a client who, as she was leaving the session where she'd had this profound light-filled after-death communication experience with her deceased loved one, she turned to her therapist and she said, "That was better than sex." So that's a pretty good endorsement of
Definitely.
IADC.
It's a truly remarkable study, Jan, and I know when we did the interview before on spontaneous end, and well, we talked about it on the induced after death communication interview because we talked a lot about your study, is that this is really one of, if not the first of its kind, right? On
It is.
this
Yeah,
particular method of counseling, induced after death
that's
communication.
That's right. That's right. And since then, there have been two more studies, one in Europe and the other in Australia, but I actually haven't seen the results of those yet. And I know that one for sure did not have a comparison group like our study did. So, but I'm not sure about the other. But anyway, the research is now starting to pick up on it. Mhm.
IADC,
IADC.
after death communication. Could you explain to our viewers how that differs from what I presume is the earlier method known as the psychomantium, that, as I recall, required more time and more involvement?
Yes, and it's a much more involved setup. So for Psychomantium, you have to actually build or have a cave somewhere or something, or build a. I know at the Institute for Transpersonal Psychology, um, oh, I'll think of his name in a minute. Did they actually built this? It had a like a pipe structure and black uh, light-proof fabric all over it. So it's like a big tent.
Mm-hmm.
And inside the would be a mirror and a chair. And under the mirror would be like a candle or some kind of very low, extremely low light source. And so a person who wants to have communication with their deceased loved one would go inside, they'd close the flap. It's completely dark in there, except sitting in the chair, looking into the mirror with this very, very dim light source under the mirror. And over time, like an hour, hour and a half, that sort of thing, many people reported that they saw images and sometimes had the sense of presence and a sense of communication with their deceased loved one. It was somewhat effective in terms of people actually having experiences and and uh, and somewhat effective in reducing grief symptoms. In induced after death communication, it's a more traditional counseling setup. You've got a client and a counselor working together. They're facing each other. The counselor, um, there are like 4 or 5 steps to this process. The first one is the counselor just talking with the client about who the deceased loved one was, what the relationship between them was, what this deceased person meant to them, and that's sort of the history sort of thing. And then in the next phase, the client identifies the single most painful aspect of their grief, and the therapist works with the client around that. It's starting by asking, how painful is it on a scale from 1 low to 10 high? And usually people say 8, 9, 10. It's up there. And then they do bilateral stimulation, which is, it can be visual, like looking at fingers going back and forth. It can be a sound, click, 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 click in your ear. It can even be, what we do is tap the backs of the client's hands, but someone on even Zoom can give them self bilateral stimulation. And we don't know exactly why it's facilitative, but what we think is that, in our culture, most people are dominant in one um, side of their brain or the other. Most of us are left brain dominant and some are right. And what we think this might do is kind of equalize the energy, which centers the person and makes them more available for information to come to them. Um, anyway, the back at this phase, by doing this and the client that do about 8 to 10 what we call sets. A set is tap tap. So like kind of like this. Then the client closes their eyes and then spends the next minute or so just being aware of whatever comes into their consciousness and uh, and then opens their eyes and reports to the therapist what they experienced. They do a little bit of exploration of that and then just start where the client left off, do this again, and then what happens next. Over the course of 5 to 10 minutes, usually, the client goes from an emotional pain level of 8, 9, or 10 down to 0, 1, or 2. And having resolved the most painful aspect of the grief, it really puts the person in an emotionally neutral state that between that neutrality and the energetic neutrality of, right, left hemispheres, it seems to facilitate the person to have communication with the deceased loved one that they're wanting the communication with. Now, that said, sometimes people get communication from deceased loved ones that they didn't intend to. I had that happen when I was being the subject, and about 70 to 75% of people in this approach to therapy end up having an ADC during the therapy. So 25 to 30% don't. Nevertheless, what our research showed is that they still benefited significantly from the therapy just from resolving that most painful aspect of the grief. You can imagine that would be a huge step forward in itself. So we the technique is called induced after death communication. We don't really induce the ADC. We don't even really induce the state of consciousness. We just facilitate it through these strategies.
You're
And
bringing
then,
the grief, the emotions down in the grief and helping them with stress, which is interesting because as you're talking, it makes me think about how this is similar methods that help people connect with their intuitive psychic abilities. Is
yeah,
to get the
absolutely.
chatter of the mind to come down and the stress and to step back from the emotions and thoughts or beliefs that keep us from being in that state where we can receive information.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's the key word is being in a receptive mode, a kind of inviting but not demanding.
Mm.
Yeah, receptive kind of state of mind. Hmm.
Well, and also how powerful that people can get their grief to come down. And when you're talking about the bilateral stimulation, that's a form of eye movement desensitization reprocessing, which is a mouthful because it
Yeah.
started with Francine Shapiro and it was using the eyes going back and forth because she found, didn't she, that when she moved her eyes like in REM from sleeping, that she was able to process distressing memories better.
Yeah, exactly. And Al Botkin, who developed IADC, he was using EMDR he was a psychologist for the Veterans Administration working with people who had PTSD following combat. And they were using EMDR to process traumatic memories and help people get past post-traumatic stress disorder. And that's when he stumbled upon being able to facilitate these after death communications that seem to have really powerful healing effects for PTSD. But then he realized it had a broader application for anybody who's grieving Anyway, as he kept working with the technique, he ended up modifying the technique so that he no longer calls it EMDR because it doesn't follow the very strict protocol of EMDR, but it does retain that same basic intervention of the bilateral stimulation. Yeah.
Which
It
seems to
reminds
help
me,
activate. I was going to say briefly, Jeff, I was going to say it seems to help activate all parts of the brain. We
Exactly.
had Jill Bolte Taylor on, who's a neuroanatomist from Harvard, and she talked about how we have four characters, one and two in the left side of the brain, and three and four in the right side of the brain, and that we can kind of get stuck or more dominant in one of those, and that by stimulating both sides of our bodies, we can activate that. So her latest book is called Whole Brain Living, so we can connect more deeply with all aspects of ourselves and the
Yeah.
universe, perhaps. Jeff, I'm sorry, go ahead.
it seems also reminiscent of the Monroe Institute hemisync
Yes.
process, where you create binaural beats
Mm.
by having different sound inputs in each ear, and the brain processes them through the corpus callosum, and my sense is that it centers the consciousness right in the center of the brain.
Nice.
Yeah, I
And,
agree.
the Monroe people suggest that it facilitates out of body experience.
Right, right, exactly. And if you think about the chakra system and the crown chakra being in the center, that kind of is our radio signal to the transpersonal domain. If we're centered, it may be easier for that energy and information and whatever to come to us.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Definitely, definitely.
yeah. So,
Well, we're getting questions coming in from our viewers. Here's one from David Wood, who says he received a phone call in a dream from his late mother, and he wonders, is that a communication based on astral travel? Was I traveling in the astral plane, or alternatively, was it initiated by the spirit who projected the image into, he says, the delta brainwave state of the mind?
yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that.
Mhm.
Um, what what I conceive of happening is that I first of all, I don't believe that consciousness is limited to the brain. So I think that the information is received in this nondescript phenomenon of consciousness and then somehow gets imprinted in our brain through however that happens. That's one of the hard questions, right? How does that information get from this ethereal place into a concrete, so to speak, image? Um,
Or maybe
so
it's there all along and we're just revealing it
exactly
as all
right.
facets of one diamond.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So I'm not sure. I mean, if either of you want to respond about your view of what's going on there, you're welcome to take a stab at it.
Well, it's pretty hard for us not having had that particular experience. It seems to me, David, that the question you're asking is one that you have to find the answer from within.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
trust.
Other people are not going to be able to describe your consciousness to you. In fact, recently, it hasn't been released. In a couple of weeks from now, and in a couple of months ago as well, I interviewed Federico Fagin, a theorist of consciousness, and he points out, this is very interesting, he points out that you can't duplicate consciousness the way you can duplicate, say, a computer software. You can duplicate it perfectly. And that's how computers are distinguished from human consciousness. Human consciousness, with the exception of telepathy, where two people can actually share consciousness. Other than that, consciousness is personal, it's individual, and my consciousness is only experienced directly by me.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we have
Mhm.
another question here from a person whose YouTube name is People Unite, which is a great YouTube name, I gotta say. They say, I miss my dear auntie. She passed this realm several months ago. Any suggestions? I would imagine they mean about communicating with them.
Yeah. Well, of course, one possibility is to go for IADC if you can find it in your area. And there is a website, I think it's induced-ADC, and it's Al Botkin's website, where there are listed therapists that he has trained. And there are therapists in I think every state where he has trained. And this can be done through telehealth via Zoom. So you don't necessarily have to have a therapist that you go to personally. Um, and I would especially recommend that if what I'm about to say doesn't work for you, because what happens in IADC is that the barriers to communication, I think, frequently get dissolved. And that's what enables the communication to occur. But for a lot of people, they don't need a really strict process like that. And right now, I'm reading a book called Signs by Laura Lynn. I believe her last name is Jackson. And she talks about, she's a psychic medium, and she talks about strategies to experience after death communication. And the way I learned about her book is that I was having lunch a couple of weeks ago with some of my former students, and I was showing them an after death communication that I'd experienced about a colleague of ours who had died. And that inspired my one of my students to say that her high school sweetheart, her mother had called to tell her that her high school sweetheart had died. Now, she hadn't been in touch with this guy for several years, but he was her first love, and she just really had such fond memories of him. And so she just really wanted to know that he was okay. So she used Laura's recommendation, and she asked for something specific. Now, it has to be not impossible, but also something that is not something you would see every day. So he had when they were in high school, he'd owned, like, I can't remember, it was a blue Chevy, some kind of specific model. I'm just going to say Chevelle because it doesn't really matter. And so she asked to see a blue Chevy Chevelle, and one time he had drunk a lot of milk and gotten sick, and had a big argument about it, and then later they always laughed about it. So she wanted also to see something with milk. So a couple of days later, she and her husband were out shopping, and her husband always picks up those flyers about things that are for sale. He picked it up, and on the cover was a blue car. And she said to him, what kind of car is that? And he said, it's a Chevy Chevelle. So there was her blue Chevy Chevelle. And then the next morning when she got up, she went to her computer. Her husband had been at the computer and left the blue Chevy Chevelle thing right there. And her son, who she said he'd never done this before, I think he's 6 or something like that, he left his empty milk glass there. So there was the glass with just a little bit of milk left in the bottom. So right there at her computer was the blue Chevy Chevelle and the milk. And she thought, I got my message. So that's an example of the kind of thing that people can do. I also suggest to my students to do dream incubation, because a lot of people have ADCs during sleep. Now, I want to just kind of go back and correct something I just said, because I don't refer to these as dreams because people say that they're qualitatively different than their normal dreams. They're clear, they're logical, there's clear communication, clear identification of the people, or the person with whom one is communicating. And people remember these experiences for decades after. They want to go back and think about them again. And this is just not typical of the way our normal dreams work. So I call them sleep ADCs.
Mhm.
And to do incubation for those involves just as I'm going to sleep at night, I might either be thinking this and inviting that my deceased loved one to come visit me during my sleep, or I might actually write something down and put it next to the bed or under the pillow or something as a kind of symbolic representation of my request. And then whenever I awaken, to pay attention to what was just going through my mind. And that some people have sleep ADCs by incubating the request. So you can make the request just generally, to for the deceased loved one to communicate however they do, or you can ask for it specifically in sleep.
That is really great advice. And I know when we did our interview before, Jan, correct me if I'm wrong, you mentioned that most spontaneous after death communications happen 1 year from the time of the loss of the loved one. And that, if I recall correctly, most people have them through dreams. I mean, there's many forms, like people can see an apparition, or there's other ways they can communicate.
That's right. Yeah, research really shows that most ADCs occur within a year of the death of the loved one. It's like the closer to the death, it's more frequent as you get further away. But people do have ADCs decades after the death of a loved one, so it isn't as if it can't happen in with a longer period of time. And then what was the other thing you said, Emmy, about?
Oh, I was just mentioning about the different forms that they can occur in, like dreams and other ways. If you could mention the different forms, I think that's helpful for people as well. But the
Sure.
dreams, I think, were the most common.
That's right. The most common state of consciousness that people report these experiences in is sleep.
Mhm.
And but they also happen when people are wide awake, when they're meditating, when they're falling asleep or waking up, and just in the normal course of life. And they can take so many forms. Like they're the most commonly reported is a nondescript sense of presence. There's just a distinct sense of presence of the deceased loved one with no sensory, no vision, no sound, no, nothing concrete, but just unmistakable sense of presence. But then sometimes there is sensory content, and it can be that I see the deceased loved one in my mind's eye. I might see them out in the physical environment. I might hear them in my mind's ear or hear something as if it's coming to me from the environment. I
Mhm.
can smell, again, in my mind's nose or with my physical nose. And touch, the same thing that sometimes people experience the touch during like a sleep ADC where it's in their mind, but sometimes they actually feel the touch physically, like lying in bed and feeling the bed depress as if the loved one is, I mean, what they're experiencing is that the loved one is sitting on the mattress and, making a depression in the mattress and they feel it physically. So, and yeah, and it can just occur in all these different states of consciousness. So the one of the really important things about asking for an after death communication is to be open to receiving it, however the deceased loved one is able to communicate. And I should have said too, there are also symbolic ones where the person might see coins, um, maybe especially with the year of the loved one's death, might see experience butterflies, dragonflies, unusually, or even things like foxes. I was just listening to Laurel and Jackson tell a story about groundhogs, and and also things like flowers blooming out of season, but on the anniversary of someone's death. It telephone calls from the dead, which is there's a book written about collected stories of people who
Two,
got
two books.
literally telephone calls from the dead. You've had experienced that, Jeffrey?
Well, my cousin Scott Rogo, distant cousin, wrote
Yes.
the original phone calls from the dead, and Callum Cooper, who works with us here on New Thinking Aloud in England, expanded on that work. Scott Rogo collected 30 cases of phone calls from the dead, and Callum Cooper, I think, has an additional 50.
Yeah,
Yeah.
lots of them. So yeah, that's great. And so absolutely anybody interested in this, I highly recommend Callum Cooper's book. It's great.
Mhm.
Yeah. So it can just take so many forms, and it's important to just be there are even electronic ones, and it may be that deceased loved ones might be able to communicate in one modality more easily than another. Things like flashing lights are another one, that electronic things, stuff coming up um, on one's computer screen. Uh, I had um, I lead a group every month, that a co-lead a group every month for people who've had near-death or related experiences. And one of my group members, his wife had passed, and she uh, shortly after she died, their daughter got married. She had helped her daughter uh, find her wedding dress, but then she died, and then the wedding happened. And then a couple of weeks later, her after the wedding, the daughter posted on Facebook her favorite picture of herself in her wedding dress. She texted her father and said, check this out, Dad. So he checked it out, he liked it, and he looked down the list of likes, and his wife liked the photo, but she had been dead for a few months at that point. He said he had her phone, but nobody had the passcode, so nobody could get into it. So either somebody hacked her Facebook, looked up this specific photo and liked it, or she somehow was able to register a like on Facebook. And
And
he thinks
she had
it's
such an experience herself.
exactly, exactly.
Yeah, my when my mother-in-law passed, it was in the middle of the night after she had gone to the crematorium. She actually was in this room for 24 hours while family came and visited her. And it was interesting. I felt like she was kind of moving in and out of her body. And my stepfather sent a message to me the following day, his condolences, and I received your text message in the middle of the night. And I said, "What text message? I didn't send you a text message." And I wouldn't send a text message unless it was an emergency or something like that. And then he sent me a screenshot. He emailed it to me from his phone, and it said, "Glad it's over." And I looked at my phone to think, well, was I sleeping and texted something, or did somebody take it into my phone? And there was nothing there. It didn't say that. So, yeah, it's in Jeff's essay, his winning essay for the Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies on the best evidence for the survival of human consciousness after permanent bodily death. I just also want to amplify what you just said, Jan, about how you mentioned that when these ADCs, after death communications, happen in dreams, that you don't really consider them dreams because it sounds like people will say that it's like how people describe it when they have near-death experiences, that it's more real than real.
That's right.
And that some of the telltale signs are that people can have a permanent change in their life. I know Jeff had that with his Uncle Harry coming to him in a dream, and that they can sometimes even get evidential information. And so I also just want to briefly mention too that Laurelyn Jackson, we've invited to be a guest on New Thinking Aloud. So we're if you know her, Jan, let her know that we would love to connect with her. I know one of our volunteers is connected with her, and so we'll invite her again. Is that we had Matthew McKay on a few times, and he communicates with his son, who sadly was murdered when he was 21 over a bicycle. And he has been communicating with his son for a number of years. In his book, Lessons from the Afterlife, he also gives a really beautiful method. And in the interview I did with him, he for free, it's in the interview. If people want to check that out on New Thinking Aloud. He gives us steps for communicating with past loved ones. And I just want to mention that New Thinking Aloud publishes a free quarterly magazine, and we have the transcript of Matt McKay in here as well. From that interview, if anybody is interested, on page 102, After Death Communication in there. So I just want to, those are a few things that came to mind as you were speaking.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, there are wonderful resources out there for anybody who wants to try this. And I think it can be helpful to hear from a couple, three different people because they might emphasize different aspects of the process that touches a particular person in a helpful way. So yeah, it's great stuff.
We have a question from Paul Leslie. Paul has been a guest on New Thinking Aloud. He,
Paul.
he's also working with us at the California Institute for Human Science, offering a course on clinical parapsychology. So he asks, what are the biggest challenges you have found in approaching transpersonal related topics with clients in a therapy setting?
What a great question. Well, I would say that um, I don't feel challenged in the sense that what I do is in my professional disclosure statement, I say that I'm specially prepared to work with transpersonal experiences, including things like near-death experiences, after-death communication, past life memories, and so forth. So I lay the groundwork there. If someone is already oriented that way, they'll know that they have found a kindred spirit. Um, and then during so then in my history taking, I ask people, have you ever had any experiences in the transpersonal domain? And I explain that transpersonal means somehow transcending the usual personal limits of space, time, identity, or influence. And they include things like near-death experiences, etc. And sometimes they'll say yes, sometimes they'll say no, sometimes they say, I'm not sure. And then depending on what their readiness is, I will or will not broach those subjects with them. And if I find they're receptive, then I might make suggestions that involve in some way the transpersonal domain. So I I guess I haven't felt challenged because I don't try to broach the subject with people that I don't perceive to be receptive.
Mm.
Yeah. And that would be the only challenge I think is if I were trying to kind of push, that
Well, you're
perspective.
also not only operating in a therapeutic setting, you're operating at the University of North Texas.
Yeah.
And I wonder how your academic colleagues have been. How receptive have they been?
This is one of those things that I feel a sense of synchronicity or I don't know what to that I landed at the University of North Texas because when I started there now that was in 1988 And I was doing research on NDEs. I can remember having conversations with a couple of my provosts, and our university, part of its reputation is that it's quirky and creative. So I landed in the right place to be doing research on some quirky, creative aspect of consciousness that, is um, it, as long as I was approaching it scientifically, they were fine. And the only time I ever, in all those years, got negative feedback was one time I was seeking an internal grant at the university to do a study of veridical perception in a hospital. That means planting visual stimuli just below the ceiling in rooms where people are likely to have cardiac arrest and be resuscitated, maybe have a near-death experience, maybe up at the corner, and happen to see this in their line of vision. And internal grants go into the grant office, and then they can be sent anywhere in the university. So some engineer could get the grant, an art professor, a musician, and I was denied the grant because the person said if the National Science Foundation found that we were doing this kind of research, UNT would lose its funding. So there was a lot of prejudice among our faculty. I'm not even sure that that statement was true, because, science, I mean, they might
But it was
scoff
a perception.
a perception. Yeah. But otherwise, I was received with either interest or neutrality. And the thing happened that I know has happened for you, Jeffrey, maybe you too, Emmy, is when people would hear that this was my area of research, they'd take me aside and say, I've never told anybody, but, I saw my father after he died.
Oh my gosh,
And
that'd be a great
yeah,
title of a book. I've never told anybody, but because I think that
yeah,
is what's happened is people have these experiences, and when they find a safe person, they share it with them because they don't want others to think that they're crazy. But it's
exactly.
changing. I think this is changing though, with more
I,
conversations like this and what other people are doing. And a lot of people believe it's real and they're starting to talk more openly about it.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I think there's a shift is occurring as more of the research. There's really good quality research on a lot of these phenomena, as Jeffrey well knows. Julie Beischel at the Windbridge Institute on mediumship and studies on after-death communication, near-death experiences. Jim Tucker carrying on even Ian Stevenson's work at the University of Virginia on children who remember previous lives. There's just a lot of good quality research, which Jeff tapped into for that award-winning Bigelow essay. And so I think as the information gets out there, all the research on parapsychology, psi phenomena, um, you know, uh, as the information gets out there, I think there's more and more. And of course, a lot of people have these experiences.
Yeah,
They just
they're pretty
don't
common.
necessarily feel safe, or they may discount the experience and kind of compartmentalize it because they just don't know what to make of it. Our Western culture doesn't prepare people well for these experiences, so they have a context to put them in when they have them. So, but I think, like you said, Emmy, I think it's changing.
Yeah, my spiritual intuitive teacher taught me that our loved ones are just a thought away. Now I know people have different beliefs about that. And also, I remember when we had our previous conversations that with you were talking about with near-death experiences. Oh, something you were just saying about that, um, what were you just saying, Jan? I just lost it and I'll come back to.
Hmm.
Well,
I
maybe
don't
we should move on to another question. It'll come back to
Okay,
me.
yeah, maybe it'll come
Um,
back to you. Yeah.
yeah, but
Mhm.
again, just that how common these experiences can be, and it's wonderful that we're having these
Oh,
conversations.
about maybe Western culture not preparing people. Yeah,
Yeah, that's what it was. When you were saying, yes. So one of the things, and this might tie into Paul Leslie's question, is I remember, I'm not sure if you said it this in conversation or if I read it in your research study, but recall you mentioning that when people had a hard time with induced after-death communication process, it was, or even integrating like a near-death experience, it was when it was outside of their worldview or spiritual or religious beliefs. Is that right?
that's right. That's right. And I did a study one time about um, back some, well, I've just had, even in our study, we had two clients who their eyes were closed and they were starting to have an after death communication experience, and they opened their eyes and said, I can't do this. And when the counselor said, okay, tell me more, it's like, this violates my religious beliefs. And it's kind of like, okay, then we won't continue, and that's fine. But privately, I think, oh, what a shame, that the person has preconceived ideas that prevent them from having an experience that might be profoundly healing to them. Well, some years back, someone, and others have said that after death communication, people who are coming from a conservative religious perspective, it might be Christian, it could be the conservative branch of any religion, might say that after death communication is of the devil, that any kind of communication with deceased loved ones is essentially evil. Well, I had an experience early in my development as a counselor where essentially this clergy person provided me with a biblical litmus test from what is and is not of Holy Spirit. And it's a passage from Galatians that says that the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. If something yields those things, then it has derived from Holy Spirit, and there's no questioning that. It's just, that's like a bottom line litmus test. And so I actually did a study asking people who'd experienced after death communication what effect that had on their sense of love, on their sense of joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, all the fruits of the Spirit. And what I found was, if you can imagine people's entries on a scattergram, it was like this, that people's love and joy and peace was greatly or increased or greatly increased. And the of only very few people indicated that it had somehow decreased any of those. And in those cases, as you said, Emmy, it almost always sounded like the person was it that the experience just contradicted their belief system, their religious belief system, or they just were uninformed. So it just wasn't part of their worldview. They didn't know how to integrate it in a positive way. So yeah,
As opposed to maybe necromancy.
that's right. Exactly
Or
right.
isn't that what it's called? Yeah, isn't that
That's
what?
right. It is.
Yeah.
It's in that same passage. There's a prohibition against necromancy. Well, what is necromancy? It's purposely conjuring up the deceased in order to get information, to get some kind of increased power in the material world. That's not what ADC is. ADC is inviting communication so that there is comfort and relief from painful grief symptoms. It's not trying to like win a war or win the lottery and use transpersonal sources to manipulate the material world. Yeah,
Right. And there's a wonderful term that I have learned that you and I talked about called continuing bonds, that this helps people with that
that's
as well.
exactly right. Yeah, that the original professional writing on grief was from Sigmund Freud, and his view was essentially get over it and move on. And what more current research has shown is that the people who do best with grief have a sense of ongoing relationship with a deceased person absolutely changed, but still ongoing. And it's not about forget about them and move on. It's about move on with a sense of an altered relationship with them. And certainly, if I can have the experience of communicating, then I have that sense of ongoing connection.
Hmm. Well, we have another. Thank you for all of this, Jan. And I also just want to say thank you from my heart to yours and with all the beautiful work you've done in this area. I know you've also worked closely with Bruce Grayson, who has done a lot in this field, and that you have, if I remember correctly, over 50 peer-reviewed journal articles or research studies. So you really are a true leader in this field. So we have another question coming in from a YouTube viewer who asks, their name is Christos Vlamis, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. What empirical evidence do we have that the experience of induced after-death communications are actually genuine and not a product of self-suggestion?
Ah, well, it's a great question. One of the things that Al says is, I don't care. I don't care whether it's a real experience or something that the individual conjures up. If it feels real to the person and has measurable healing effect, then it's a useful tool. Now, that said, we do have cases of veridical after death communication, just like we have cases of veridical near death experiences. Veridical means that during the experience, the person gets information that is not available to them through normal means. And then that information is shown to be correct. So, an example is, and I think I've used this one before, but it's worth repeating. This man, his father dies. And after the funeral, he remembers that a couple years before, his father had said to him, "You're the only person I'm telling this to. I bought a gun for protection, and it's up in the top shelf of my closet. I haven't even told your mother. But if anything happens to me, please go get it and remove it from the house, because if your mother came across it, she wouldn't know what to do." So he's helping her mother clean out her father's stuff. He's right there, he like goes up, can't find it. Long story short, he looks everywhere, cannot find this gun anywhere, and thinks, well, I don't know, maybe dad got rid of it and just didn't think to tell me. I don't know. A few days later, nights later, he has an experience while he's sleeping. He's in his parents' house. He's walking down the stairs into the basement. His father's calling to him from above and saying, "Yeah, go down the stairs." And he's saying, "But Dad, I've searched the basement." And his dad says, "No, no, keep going into my dark room." And he's like, "But Dad, I searched the dark room." And his dad says, "No, no, keep going. Go over to this cabinet, pull it away from the wall. You'll find the gun lodged between the cabinet and the wall." He wakes up. He thinks, wow, what was that? At first, he thinks, nah, that can't be. But finally, it's bugging him. So he goes over to his parents' house. "Mom, you mind if I go into the basement, look around?" "No, go ahead, sweetheart." So he goes down the stairs into the dark room, over to the cabinet, pulls it away from the wall. There is the gun lodged between the cabinet and the wall. He is absolutely sure his father never told him that he'd moved the location of the gun. But how could he actually had searched that room high and low and couldn't find it. So it's the collection right now. The best we have is the collection of cases that have been researched. And in the case of near-death experiences, we have the book "The Self Does Not Die" in its second edition, over 125 cases of verified paranormal phenomena during near-death experiences, verified by credible third parties, usually the physician who was caring for the patient who had the experience. And we're collecting right now I'm working with a team at the University of Virginia to collect cases of veridical after-death communication. And so, most of the content of after-death communication is not provable. The deceased loved one is there saying, "I'm fine. I'm still connected to you. I love you." and I'll see you again. Those are the main messages of after-death communication. But sometimes there is veridical information and that points to the ones that don't have veridical may be just as real as the ones that do, because subjectively they feel the same.
We have a question from one of our regular viewers named Andrei Slavash Krasowski, who brings up a fascinating case, and he wants to know if you know of any others like it. This is a case of a philosopher named A.J. Ayer, who was very famous when I was young. I read his work, a logical positivist and atheist, who then had a near-death experience and came out publicly and said, I'm no longer an atheist. And
Yes.
Andre is asking if you know of other cases of that sort.
Exactly. And uh, a lot of cases, I'm Bruce Grayson and I have been talking about writing a book about physicians who've had near-death experiences because there's a pattern of, they were educated in the materialist paradigm. Everything is has a physical source and everything can be explained in material terms. And then they have a near-death experience and they realize that materialism is, valid but limited and does not tell the whole story. And it's, one after another. It's like that. So yeah, there are definitely those cases. And if this person would like to hear more cases, Mary Neal is an orthopedist who had this shift, and Eben Alexander, a former Harvard neurosurgeon who experienced this shift, and Peter, and I'm not going to be able to remember his name, but he's on the IANS video listing. There's an interview by him, and he's a forensic pathologist, an MD, but doing forensic like.
Peter Cummings?
Yes, thank you so much. That's it, Peter Cummings, and he went through this shift. So yeah, it's it's hard to find anything that's a substitute for the experience. The experience is real, is what makes it real for people.
Right. It's that empirical, like William James, right? Jeff talks about empirical evidence or data, which comes from within yourself.
Hmm.
And that is perhaps one of the best ways of verifying or knowing.
Yeah,
I just also want to add that from the other side of life, I've had this experience and others have where they have announcing dreams. I had this with one of my brother's three children, where I dreamt of the children before his wife either knew she was pregnant or she was about a month pregnant. Granted, this was over 20 years ago. This was before she had an ultrasound, before she had biological indications that she may be pregnant. And I knew what the child looked like, their personality, their sex, what characteristics they might take after in from other family members. And so when they were born and I went to the hospital, I felt like I was just seeing them again, like I wasn't meeting them for the first time. So I just want to offer that Jeff taught me that term, announcing dreams, and that it's usually the mother or the father who has that. Now, I don't have any biological children. I was very close to my brother and his wife at the time, and so somehow those souls came to me, and I think that that's very evidential as well.
absolutely. And even in the realm of after death communication, Michael Shermer,
Mm.
who's a very staunch, has been a very staunch um,
Skeptic,
dis pardon?
skeptic.
Skeptic, if not cynic, right? And
Well, Stanley Krippner loves the word scoffers rather than
yeah,
skeptic.
there you go, a scoffer.
Yeah.
So he has written about this that when he was getting married, his wife had been raised by her grandfather who had died before their marriage, and uh, somehow in the months before, well, I guess when she was moving in with him, she had a bunch of her stuff shipped And he was going through the boxes and he found this old transistor radio that had belonged to her grandfather. And he, Michael Shermer, tried to make it work and could not make it work at all. So he just stuck it in this drawer in the a back bedroom. And then the wedding day came. They got married at home. And right before the service, she was feeling really sad that her grandfather wasn't there. And she asked Michael if they could just go into the house for a minute alone and she could just share how sad she was that her grandfather couldn't be there. As they're in the house, they hear music coming from the back of the house. Long story short, the transistor radio was working and generating this music. And after they couldn't actually figure out how to make it stop. So they went on with the service and everything. And then when they came back into the house after that, it had stopped. So it was only around the wedding service. And he said, you know, that if it hadn't happened to him, he wouldn't have believed it or would have tried to write it off some way, but he himself knew that he could not make that radio work. And then for it to spontaneously start was just and playing the kind of music it did when it did, it was so symbolic that he really couldn't deny it. It's the only experience he's had that he claims he can't explain. So that was a veridical ADC. Yeah.
I think he interprets it a little differently, though. I think he hasn't not become a skeptic as a result
No,
of that.
he's not.
He's remained a skeptic, very active in the skeptical community. And I think his point is that things just happen, just one of those things. It's likely to happen to anybody, but don't take it too seriously.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Well, as we say in Texas, bless his heart, you know. But you know, there's a certain, I feel a certain, after that snarky remark, I feel a certain sadness because there's something so meaningful about having, I guess, the courage to believe that there's something more. And it's so enriching to life, to have that sense. And especially that a lot of times people who are open to this really find support and help from, you know, quote unquote, the other side. And and how sad to be turned off to a source of support.
Well,
So,
since you bring it up, I should mention Michael Shermer happens to live here in the same city where I am, Albuquerque. And I
really?
have invited him to be on New Thinking Aloud. He's never responded to me, but since his name has come up, I will publicly issue that he has an open invitation.
Great.
I'd be very happy to have a conversation with him.
Yeah, I think it would be great if y'all had a conversation that he read your Bigelow essay and and
That
his
might be
reaction.
asking too much.
Well, and it
Yeah.
really demonstrates, oh, go ahead, Jeff.
No, no, you
I
go.
was just going to briefly just mention that it demonstrates, somehow I'm getting in, oh, I thought I had an echo. For a moment I did, how when people are in their left brain analytical, judging, doubting, analyzing mind, that it can keep us from being open perhaps to some of these experiences. And maybe sometimes it kind of squeaks in to just say, hey, y'all, like you said, y'all, there's more going on here than you like to think there is.
Yeah, exactly.
And then
Well,
when we have faith and trust and are open, we can have more of these experiences.
yeah, that's right. It's kind of like the sheep-goat effect, right? This is the research that shows that the beliefs and expectations of the researcher actually influence the results of the study. And similarly, our beliefs can open us or limit us to the kinds of experiences that we have. Now, sometimes the experiences break through despite our beliefs, which can actually be troubling because then I've got to rethink my whole approach to the world. But ultimately beneficial because I have a bigger sense of the world than I used to. But anyway, that just that we we can open or limit ourselves by our beliefs.
Right. And even in healthcare, just a quick side note that research is coming out in that arena as well, that our health and wellness in a lot of cases is up to us. In fact, research is showing that people used to think it was just genetics or there's the nature versus nurture debate, and that what we believe about our health and also what we believe will help us often will. So there's a real strong component about belief in all of this, it seems.
Yeah, that's right. The placebo effect is a researched phenomenon where people have effects from like medication that they've been told, and yet there's no scientific, actually, unbeknownst to the person, no scientific basis for that to actually happen. And there have been cases where people were in studies where they were, some people were given the actual medication, some given dummy medication to see if the actual medication really works. And people who got the dummy medication, and they were all told that one of the risks of this medication was losing your hair. And one of the people in the dummy medication group lost her hair. And so it's very powerful. Our thoughts are powerful. You know, whenever I get on this subject, I just one of the things I love about Anita Moorjani's near-death experience. She was in end-stage lymphoma. She weighed like 75 pounds, and she was finally unconscious and brought to the hospital. She had lesions all over her body and tumors, and her organs were shutting down. She had this profound near-death experience, met her deceased father. At the end of it, he and she are hovering over her hospital bed, and her mother's there, her husband's there. I think her brother had arrived by that time. And her father said, "It's time for you to decide if you're going to go back into that body or stay here." And, you know, it feels good here because there's no pain and it's blissful and all that. And so she's, you know, like reluctant. And she said, "Besides, um, a nurse just came and took a blood sample, and isn't that blood sample going to show whether my organs are continuing to shut down or whether they somehow spontaneously are starting up again?" And her father said to her, "What you decide here is going to determine the outcome of the blood test." So that turns our thinking upside down. We think that if I draw blood, the answer is inextricably in the blood. But what he was saying is that our intentions can influence the physical world. And so, and that's where things like placebo effect and positive thinking, you know, the research showing that, you know, practicing gratitude and things like that actually has a positive effect on your immune system. So, so you know, there's a lot to harness in this area that I think we miss out on.
I just want to also add that I'm seeing a few comments in the chat screen of the live stream today about people communicating or sensing their pets. And I'm wondering, Jan, if you have any information from your travels about that.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, my former doctoral student, now Dr. Jenny Streithorn, did her dissertation on a systematic review of all research on ADC that had been published up to 2010. And she generated a definition of ADC that was about communication with deceased people. And I actually, because of research, had to expand it to say, or animals, because people do have ADCs and even have had veridical ADCs with animals. Another member of that monthly group had a dog who passed, and one of his habits was he would do like this in the carpet and kind of dig up a spot in the carpet. So one day after he had passed, she was cleaning her house, vacuuming all the rooms, and she was alone at home. She vacuums this room, she closes the door, she goes on, finishes all the vacuuming. Later in the day, she came back, and as she walked into the room, she saw in the middle of the room one of those dug up spots in her carpet. And she's just like, I think my former pet was here to just let me know he's still around. So, yeah. And, I've heard other animals. I have a friend who one night after her husband died, her dog came and jumped up on, she was getting ready for bed. The dog came and jumped up on the bed and was looking up in the corner of the room and barking. And she's like, "What?" And she looks up there and there's this green orb,
Hmm.
and she suddenly got the sense this was her husband, and the dog is like barking, barking. And then the dog jumps down and runs out. And she's like, "What?" And the dog runs back in, and he's got the favorite toy that he used to play with her husband. And he drops it on the bed, and he's like, like waiting, like, "Let's play with my toy." And then eventually the orb just disappeared. She said that it's like her dog deflated
Hmm.
and he jumped off from the bed, and she followed him, and he went to his own bed and laid down and just laid there and looked kind of, sad. And so the dog actually helped her notice what she otherwise might not have noticed. So
Hmm.
animals can be very vital in not only the deceased ones bringing their own messages, but the living ones helping humans recognize when their own ADCs are happening.
Yeah, I lost
Mhm.
my dog of almost, let's see, 15 years in December. And when she passed, of course, very sad. She was a constant companion of mine and just a sweetheart, and we'd go for daily walks, and a lot of love happened there. And when she passed, it was the first time we didn't have a dog in our house for 18 years, and it felt very strange. At the same time, I wanted to see if I could feel her presence. So I would just meditate and just sense her. Of course, one could say I was making it up, but I did feel, even in my grief, I felt this peaceful presence. Like she was still like I sensed her on the couch and just kind of hanging out. And it was very calming for me to be able to feel that, and it did help my grief actually.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, a perfect example of the sense of a continuing bond,
Oh.
that your emotional bond continues, and how comforting that can be. Yeah,
We just got
that's
a new
what,
puppy a couple days ago also, so the life and death cycle continues.
yeah, yeah, for
Or
sure.
what we perceive as death, right? I mean, that's just a term
Hmm.
in
Yeah.
what we perceive as the physical world. So I know we've just got about 10 minutes left here. And Jeff, do you have a question you wanted to
Yeah,
ask?
here's one from a viewer named Rafael Reyes, who says, I communicate with dead loved ones while lucid dreaming. Is that a valid way?
Yes, because you do it.
That was an easy answer.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, what a gift. I mean, it's one thing to have an experience while I'm asleep that I didn't anticipate or expect, and then wake up from it and realize it and benefit from it. But imagine being able to be lucid while it's happening and be able to purposefully ask questions or um, share information and that sort of thing. It sounds like a wonderful gift.
And it doesn't necessarily have to be only a gift, as I know there are quite a few programs available for people to cultivate the art of lucid dreaming.
Yeah, yeah, yep, yep, exactly.
And
And so that might be for somebody who's interested in both. They might pursue both the lucid dreaming and ADC while lucid dreaming. Yeah.
Mhm. I
Mhm.
wanted to mention earlier when we were talking about the distinction between a regular dream and a dream with a deceased loved one. I recall we did a wonderful interview some years ago with a Jungian therapist named Stephanie Stevens, who researched Carl Jung's attitude about this particular question. And she pointed out that in his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, Jung talked about a powerful dream he had of his father, in which he wrote about it this way. He didn't say, I dreamt of my father. He said, my father visited me
Yeah, I love that.
in the dream. And so I've come to call these kinds of dreams visitations.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a great word. And it uh visitations during sleep.
Mhm.
Hmm. Yeah, I was talking with one of my former students, Dr. Farnoosh Nouri, and she grew up in Iran. And we were on this subject of, the terminology for these experiences. And she said in Farsi, there are two words for experiences during sleep. And one means dream, and the other means a vision,
Mhm.
and that they're recognized in that culture as being subjectively different experiences. And it's just, I think using visitation is a really good one because we don't have the terminology for these experiences. It's, yeah, there is like not widespread accepted terminology, but I like visitation.
Yeah.
Well, certainly for anybody who is a student of biblical literature, there are many examples of visions in the Bible going back to Joseph, and archaeologists come up with even older ones, like
Mhm.
the Egyptian pharaoh who was out camping in the desert and had a dream that if you dig right here, you can uncover the Sphinx,
Mm.
and he did.
Wow. Wow. Yeah.
And left a big stone monument describing the whole thing right
Hmm.
between the two paws of the Sphinx.
Huh. Wow. So powerful.
Mhm.
Well, you two are among a leading group of people who can coin such terms like visitation dreams
Ah,
and help that term spread widely. We have a question from Hakan Callis. What if our after death experiences are staged by beings in the astral plane to make us believe in an illusion? What if the whole thing is a fake and we are some kind of louche farmed beings? Not sure what that means.
I researched it, Emmy. I saw that question and I was wondering what does louche mean? So I looked it up as a
Mhm.
matter of fact, and as best I can tell, it it's comes out of a Gnostic vision of evil archons
Okay.
who create stressful situations for human beings. And when human beings are under stress, then they give off this energy called loosh,
Mm.
which these archons feed upon. So
Okay.
it's kind of honestly, I think of it as a paranoid vision. Not that it's untrue, I don't know, but uh, that's to my understanding the meaning of the question.
Hmm.
Okay. Well, two things come to mind, and maybe you all have additional thoughts. One is that if these visions are stressful, that's the opposite effect that ADCs have on the vast majority of people. And as I said, I've done actual research where people have said their sense of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control have all increased as a result of these experiences. So it really sounds different. And
Mm.
then the illusory aspect, I mean, I guess ultimately I don't know, this whole thing may be a dream, but the best that I can respond to is, again, to look to veridical cases where people get information that we can't figure out how they could have gotten it through any normal means or reasoning or anything like that, and yet it's idiosyncratic and it turns out to be accurate. So if this is all a dream, it's a very interestingly crafted one where we get evidence that experiences are real within the dream. I don't know.
Also, I suppose if there are evil archons out there who would like to be fed by love, joy, peace, etc., let them have it.
Yeah, exactly. They might not be so evil. Yeah, yeah. Huh.
And I think it's fair to remind our viewers, many of whom I'm sure have never been in a meeting of the International Near Death Association, that it's an extraordinarily loving environment. You walk into any of those meeting rooms, and the atmosphere it just glows with a sense of people recognizing their own and each other's spiritual depths.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. There is something magical about near death International Association for Near Death Studies conferences. A few years ago, I had some students. The counseling program that I where I was a professor. One of their specializations was play therapy, working with children ages 2 to 10 in counseling, and but I had some students who were also interested in transpersonal, so they came with me to. It so happened to be the IANS conference that was in Hawaii. And after a day or so, they pulled me aside and they said, you know, we've been to play therapy conferences and this conference. And they said, you'd think that people who are dedicated to the well-being of children, that there would be a sense of camaraderie and cooperation and an esprit de corps. And they said, it's not like that at all. It's competitive and backbiting and a lot of those, you know, standard academic things. But this conference, there is this sense of connectedness and warmth and love. And they said that, you know, we're feeling here what we thought we would feel there. So, yeah. And of course, people always say that about those attending those kinds, the IANS conference, I can talk about things here that I can't talk about out there
Mm.
because there still is misunderstanding and stigma that research shows is not founded, and yet it's still, you know, somewhat present in our culture.
So
Yeah.
it's worth reminding our viewers that your conference this year will be on Labor Day weekend in Chicago. And if people are serious about exploring this realm, it's one of the best of all possible places to be.
Thank you so much for that plug. I really appreciate it. It really is it is a special, and we do talk about things, not only near death experiences, but the kinds of things we've been talking about here. So there are quite a number of programs to choose from. Mhm.
Well, and also isn't the one of the common features that people describe in near-death experiences aren't isn't love like one of the, if not the primary message that
Abs-
people receive, and also in after-death communications? I mean, there's many forms of information that can be shared, but I'm just curious, what are some of the common messages you've seen in your research with after-death communication?
Yeah, the sense that the deceased is well and whole, no matter what their physical circumstances were prior to their death, that they're aware of the living, that they're still interested in and supportive of the living, and that the living and the deceased will be reunited someday when the living person passes, or whatever term you use for death. Um,
Transitions or
yeah, so those are the main things, and you know, understandably, those are very comforting messages.
And
Yes.
I know from interviewing Eben Alexander and others, Elizabeth Crone, they both describe not just getting the message, because it's no longer a case of me and the message being separate. They become one with it. So Elizabeth Crone described to me a feeling that she had of awesome love. That she said, and I know about love. I'm a mother. She said this transcended anything. That the powerful love a mother feels for a child is nothing compared to the love they felt in the near-death experience that they bring back.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very synchronistic. You should mention Elizabeth because she's going to be our case illustration for the Iron Spring Symposium, which is a one-day online event, Saturday, April 26th. And we're going to be exploring specifically NDEs and related experiences with the issues of religion, spirituality, and healthcare. And she's going to talk about, she's going to emphasize the aspect of her experience afterwards, where she told Jewish clergy, Christian clergy, and a professor of religious thought about her NDE and how she was responded to and what effect it had on her integration process. But before that, she's going to tell her story again. And for those of who don't know, she was struck by lightning in a synagogue parking lot in Houston, Texas, and had a profound near-death experience. So anyway, anybody who wants to join us for the symposium will be, the website for the symposium will probably go up in a couple of weeks. So if you just go to IANDS for International Association for Near-Death Studies.org and watch the website, you'll see the symposium information come up.
Well, Jan, it has been a joy to be with you. I hope that I'll be with you again in Chicago. And I hope to have you back on New Thinking Aloud many times.
I would love to come back. This has just been an absolute joy. Thanks to both of you, Emmy and Jeffrey.
Oh, our pleasure. And for those of you watching or listening, thank you for being with us because you are the reason that